Hello everyone, my name is Michael McCann, and welcome to this Wayward Art Company tutorial on creating atmospheric effects for the Blender game engine. First I'll talk about how I fake the volumetric light from open spaces such as windows. And then I'll be making an animated texture for fog. And then lastly I'll be creating all these chaotic dust particles. So for a while I've been working on a general art portfolio, and that includes some small mini games that I've been working on. Right now I'm in the concept phase for creating a horror game. And I'd like it to be more than just a demonstration of modeling and texturing. I'd really like it to be good. And so as something of a survey, let me know in the comments below what you guys find scary. So this is the scene that I'll be using to demonstrate these effects. And right now it's just a hallway, and the sky is just a single plane. And the hall looks like it would be a very dirty and not particularly well kept place. But the air seems very clean and open, so it would be hard to pass this off as sort of a grungy, dirty environment. Even here with the light on the floor, there's no indication that anything is moving through it. So the very first thing that I can do is just turn on the mist. And I have the mist set to this, light, pale, yellowish orange color. And just by turning it on and off, you can see that makes a huge difference. But I'd like to start creating some of these other effects. So the very first thing that I'll work on is to fake that volumetric light coming through the window. And the biggest mistake that I see people making when creating a light texture is putting in too many light rays. Remember, the number of light rays that you have are determined by how many obstacles that the light is passing through. So something like a really complicated window like the stained glass would have a lot of rays, but something really simple would have very few rays. Now I've opened GIMP and I've created a texture that's 512 by 512, and I'm going to use my gradient tool, and with the foreground black I'm going to select the background color and make it something that I suppose is real world sense for your scene. So in my scene this sort of a yellowish orange will work. I'm going to start 1/3 of the way through the texture and just drag the gradient to one side. And now I'll select my airbrush tool. And with the foreground color still set to black, I'll take the size of the brush up a little. And I'm going to click and hold Shift to drag these guidelines so that I can make the lines really straight. I'll put one at the top and one at the bottom. And then I'll make 3 or 4 in the middle. And that should be adequate for the window that I have in my scene. So now I'm going to go to Filters and then Blur and choose Gaussian Blur. And then I'll just blur the entire image so that those lines look a little, fuzzy. And then go to Colors and Color to Alpha and choose Black. And now all that's left are the light rays. So now go to File and export your image. Then back in Blender, type Shift A and add a cube. And now just position it in front of the window. And tab into edit mode and scale it down so that it's roughly the size of the window's opening. From front view I'm going to scale it on X. And now I'm going to use the select tool by typing C and just select the front and the back faces. Because they just don't need to be there, of course. So now we have just these 4 sides. And with the edge select, I'm going to select this top edge and hit Control E and then mark a seam. And I think it's time now to apply a material and the texture. So I'll open up my UV image editor and add a material. I'm going to make this shadeless. And I'll turn on transparency and move the alpha all the way down. And then open a new texture and find the one that you just created. And under the influence section, underneath of color, check alpha. And then type U and unwrap. And I want these UVs to take up the whole texture space, because later I'll be going over a technique of how to make the air seem really heavy and make it affect the light. And so it's very important that it take up the whole texture space for that. So that's looking okay, but I want there to be some more of these breaks in the light, so I can just make a few adjustments here to the scale on the y-axis. And that looks a little better. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to point the light so that it's going in the direction of the light on the floor. So right now it's right below sort of where the stairs begin. So I'll use that as a reference. Okay, looks like it matches up pretty closely. And I also have to do it from the top because it's sort of going at an angle. So I'll just move it a little to the right. And that looks pretty well lined up. Now from inside you can't see anything, so you need to go back to your material and click the backface culling. You have to uncheck that. So now you can see the light from inside as well. And now that I'm looking at it, I think I'm going to try to line up those beams a little better by using the y-axis scaling again. So I'll just adjust it until, I don't need it to be perfectly accurate, but getting it a little closer. Something like that looks like it'll work. And I'm going to take the alpha down because I don't want it to be too bright. That's looking pretty good. Although there's a good chance that later, after all the effects are in the game, I might, readjust them, but for now that looks all right. Actually, it's still a little bright, and also I need to move it back closer to the window. It looks like there's a little gap there. Yeah, that looks a lot better, I think. Now I can begin working on the animated texture. I'll add a plane, and then go into top orthographic view with 7 on the number pad, and then hit Control-Alt-0 to go into camera view. Now I'll select the camera, and under my resolution, I want it to be 256 by 256. And then in my camera settings, under the lens, I'm going to go to orthographic and change the orthographic scale to 2.0, which is the exact size of the plane. Now I'm going to go to cycles render and go to my compositing. So I'll go into rendered view and change my world background to black. And now I can select my plane and give it a new material. and it's going to be an emission material. Now type Shift A and go to Shader, Transparent Shader, and put it above the emission shader, and combine them by holding Alt and right mouse click and drag them together. Now type Shift A and add a texture, noise texture, and use the factor as the mixed value on the mix shader. Now we'll need a way to animate this, so with this node selected, just hit Control T, and that adds a mapping and texture coordinate node. Now type Shift A and add a converter color ramp, and add another marker here in the middle with that plus sign. And I'll just change the color to somewhere right in the middle between black and white. Now if I move the black value forward a little, some of that transparency starts to come through. I'm going to take the detail on the noise texture all the way up, and now adjust this middle slider somewhere right in the middle. I think will probably work. You don't want those values to be too bright. Okay, so that's looking okay, but I want the bottom to be mostly transparent so that you don't see it being cut off where it meets the floor. So I'm going to type Shift A, Texture, and Gradient Texture, and hit Control T to give this a mapping and texture coordinate node as well. And then again, I'm just going to combine these with Alt and right mouse click and drag them together, and that adds a Mix RGB node. I'm going to set it to multiply and take the factor all the way up. But now the gradient is, it's rotated the wrong way, so we're going to rotate it on Z, negative 90 degrees, and now it's on the bottom. And I'll change the gradient type to easing, which is a sort of a softer blend. So now back to our noise texture node. We're going to animate this by the mapping node. And right now the location, I don't know if this ever repeats for sure, but I know that you can use the Y rotation. And this of course has to do with which direction your plane is facing. Right now we're on Y. So like right now it's at 0 degrees. So if I set this to something like, like 100 degrees, you can see that the texture changes. But back to 0 and then to 360, which is a full circle, you can see that the texture doesn't change at all. Because even though it's a flat plane, in the texture space, it's rotating like it would in 3D space. So it makes its way all the way around to a full circle. So you could make a tileable texture this way, or it isn't really tileable, but it's a repeating texture. So I'll just hover over these rotation values and hit I to add a keyframe, and that's at frame 1. And I want my end frame to be 100 frames. Now we need to go all the way up to frame 101. And this is where we're going to add in our next keyframe. The reason we're going to 101 is because if we set that last frame at 100, because our first frame and our last frame are the same, it would repeat the same frame twice, and we don't want that. So at frame 101, we'll change the Y rotation to 360 and hit I to add in that other keyframe. Now if I hit Alt A, you can see that it's animating and it's repeating, but it's moving at a weird speed and it's slowing down at the beginning and the end. So I'm going to open up my dope sheet, and with material 0.001 selected, I'm going to hit T, and then under interpolation, choose linear. And now it's just moving at a constant speed, which is still kind of fast, but that's okay because we'll slow it down with the animated texture. So now back to my render options, I'm going to, underneath of film, click transparent. And this way it won't render the background. Now I'm going to render out a single image, and I'm going to go into my compositing, which is just down here. Just click this little composite tab and then click use nodes. Because these images are very small, they're 256 by 256 pixels, and I'm worried about the images looking a little pixelated. So I'm going to drop in a blur node and then just blur it a little on the X and the Y. And that might help to keep the texture from looking a little jagged. Okay, so I think now I'm ready to render out all of these images. But I don't want to do this to the temp folder. I'm just going to create a new folder on the desktop, and I'll just call this fog. And so here under output, I'll just select that folder from my desktop. And everything else looks good. So I'll click animation, and that'll put all 100 frames into that folder. So currently there is a little bit of a bug in the software that I use to do screen capturing. So if I click on if I click on certain things in the header for GIMP, it will crash. So I'm going to tell you how to set up a texture for an animated texture, but I won't actually be able to show you. So the very first thing is that the texture is 2560 by 2560 because it's 100 frames at 256 by 256 pixels. Now go to View and choose Show Grid, and then choose Snap to Grid. And then under Image, go all the way down to Configure Grid. And under the height and the width, choose 256. And if you've done that, then you'll have something that looks like this. Now, because all of the images that we have in our animated texture are transparent and white, we won't be able to see them unless we use the fill tool to add a color to the background. So I'm just going to choose this dark blue color and fill the entire thing. And we'll delete it at the end, but for right now it'll help us to see what we're doing. Now I'm going to select the Move tool and drag the first texture in. And I'm going to make sure that I select Move the Active Layer. And then I'm just going to start bringing each of these textures in. And they do snap to the grid, which helps, but it's still a very boring process. And I certainly won't make you watch the whole entire thing. I want to explain something about these animated textures. So I'm just going in order, being careful that I'm selecting the correct images. And then when I get all the way finished to the first row, I'm going to start the new row all the way on the left-hand side. So this is how Blender reads animated textures. It starts at 1 to 10, and then 11 through 20, and 21 through 30, and so on. So that's very important to know. So I'll just go ahead and finish this, and then come back to you when it's done. Okay, so that only took 13, 14 minutes or so, but it helps just to put some earphones in and just power through it. So now that that's done, I can go to that background color and delete that layer. And because we still have 100 layers, I'm going to go to image and then merge visible layers. And I of course can't click on that because it will crash, but you'll want to, and then export the image to a place where you'll be able to find it. And now I can show you 3 different ways to use a texture like this. There's actually a number of ways that you can use it, but for this type of environment, I'll show you a few different options. The very first way, I'll just add a plane, and then rotate it and scale it so that it fits pretty much the whole hallway. I'm more worried about the top in this instance, because the bottom, we set that gradient so that it's mostly transparent on the bottom. Okay, and it's always wise to position these in places where, like the openings of doorways, or someplace where you won't really notice that it's just cutting off where, it meets the walls on each side. Now I'm just going to unwrap this, and I can give it a new material and click shadeless, uncheck backface culling, and then check transparency and take the alpha all the way down. Then give it a new texture, and then select that animated map. Now check alpha. Now we need to map this so that it's a animated texture. So type N to bring up your options in the UV image editor. Click animated under game properties. Then set the X and the Y to 10. And the start frame is going to be 0 and the end frame will be 99. And then just take the speed up to, I'm going to start at 8 and see what that looks like. Now, I've talked before about animated textures and how there's a bit of a bug. If you select anything else and then hit Control-Z, it will fix the coordinates on the texture. That's if you even have the problem, but that's something I've had to do in recent versions of Blender. So that's working, but there's a bit of a lag because my screen capture software is going. So I might actually test this out in the game logic editor, because the screen's smaller and I think it'll play a little more smoothly. So this is one technique that you can use, and I'm going to show you another one that's actually really handy. Maybe not so much for this scene, but I'm going to go to a new scene and I'm going to label this fog. And so these options need to be fixed again. We need to go to Blender Game and change it to the shading to GLSL, because it resets every time you go to a new scene. So I'll type Shift-A and add a plane, and then type Shift-A and add a camera, and use Alt-R to clear the rotation on it. And I'll take the camera just above the plane. I want the plane to fit inside of the camera, so that looks okay. So now I'll give this a new material, and I'll set this up exactly the same way as I did before, except we won't need to do those options in the UV image editor again. They're already set from before. Okay, so now if I hit play, you have this mist that just sort of passes by the camera. So what I want to do now is go back to my first scene and select the camera and go to the game logic. And then I want to add a scene actuator. And I want to switch this from restart to add overlay scene. And then I'll just use this always sensor. Oh, and I forgot to add what scene I want to overlay. So just choose fog in your in the actuator. And there it is. It's kind of, it's not really suitable necessarily for this scene because you know it would be more for like, you know, a nighttime scene outside where like the environment is like a little damp and foggy. This area is a little too dry, but you could probably use it for other scenes, like if there's like a fire in a room and you wanted to create sort of this thick, you know, hazy smoke. You know, there's lots of reasons, you know, circumstances where this could, you know, look really cool. But yeah, this room I think is just too dry, and like I don't really think that kind of volumetric fog would exist. So I'm just going to delete this actuator. And I will keep that fog in the doorway. Again, that window is the only source of light, so I would like it to appear that, you know, like it's showing how the light is, it's sort of showing how thick the air is. So I will take the alpha down a little bit because I don't want it to be too obvious. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to do one more thing with that animated texture to create sort of the illusion that the air has some thickness to it. And what I'm going to do is actually just apply it to the light texture that's coming in through the window. So I'll just select this and go back to the textures. And add in that animated texture. But I want to flip these, so I want the light to be underneath of the animated texture. And I'll have to play with this a little bit. I'm not really sure. I'll first try overlay. That's not right. Oh, I know. I didn't select the alpha. Okay. Underneath of the diffuse and the influence, you need to select alpha. And now you can see it moving. Of course, take the alpha down. And now I can make some more adjustments to the light texture. Maybe overlay is wrong. Maybe I'll stick with mix. Yeah, okay. And that sort of creates the effect that, like, you know, that there's like heavy air and it's passing through the light. So, you know, it isn't the most noticeable thing, but sometimes it's the little things like that that really make, you know, the whole environment sort of come to life. So everything's looking pretty good. The last thing I want to do though is add the dust, which I think is the coolest effect. So for that I need to go back into GIMP, and the texture size again is 512 by 512. And I'm just going to fill the background with black. And with the airbrush, I'm just going to use white and fill in a whole bunch of little dots. The reason I'm using the airbrush is because it's a little softer than the paintbrush. And I'm also giving some of the dots 1 click, some 2 clicks with the mouse, and some 3 clicks, because this gives it a variety in the opacity. Okay, when that's done, I'm going to color and go to color to alpha and then set it to black. Now you have a transparent image with a bunch of white dots. And so now I'm going to go back to the scene that we had labeled fog, and we're going to reuse this scene to create the dust effect. So I'll just delete this plane. And I'll add a new plane, but I'll move it to the second layer. Now I'll tab into edit mode and unwrap it, and then apply that dust texture. I also made 2 dust textures. So the steps that you saw me doing the first time in GIMP, I did that a second time to give a little bit of variation to the dust. Okay, so I'm going to open up the UV image editor because I'm going to scale this a little bigger to make the dust smaller. Okay, that looks pretty good. So I'll change the name of this plane to Dust 1. And now I'll add another plane and apply the second texture that I made in GIMP. You don't really have to do this a second time, but I do recommend it. It really makes a difference in the overall effect. And again, I'm setting this up the same way. The only difference is that I'm applying the other texture to it. Okay. So now I'll label this plane Dust 2. And I'm going to give both of these planes some logic. So I'll add a always sensor and a motion actuator. And I want this to be moving toward the camera, so on the positive z-axis. So I'll set it to something really low, like 0.01. And then I also want it to be rotating. So I'll set this on the z rotation to 0.2. And I'm going to do the same exact thing for the other one. The only difference is that on the z rotation, I'll have it set to negative 0.2. So that way one is spinning clockwise and the other is spinning counterclockwise. So now I'll linger over top and hit P to play, and that's working. So one's spinning one way and the other is spinning the other way. I'm going to take the alpha down on both of them again because you don't want it standing out too much. This is actually a technique that I originally had created to simulate snow, and the only difference is the direction in which it's moving toward the camera. But it works as a very convincing method for snow. So I just added an empty, which I selected the cube, and I just moved it up right underneath of the camera. And I'm going to give it 2 random sensors. I'm going to make them both true. And I'll set the skips to the first one to 40 and then the second one to 38 because I want them to be relatively close. And now I'll add 2 edit object actuators. And they're already set to add object, which is what you want. So in the first one, I'll select under the object Dust 1, and the second one will be set to Dust 2. And then here, under the time, I'm going to set them to about 300. and that's the time in which they'll die, because you want them to die eventually. You don't want them to just continuously be adding geometry to your scene. So I don't even know if you can see that. It's very faint, but that's good because you don't want it to be very bright. But we can make it brighter if we need to. So now I'll go back to my default scene, and I'm going to add back that scene actuator for the camera, and this time choose that scene again. Plug the always sensor in, and now you're able to see those dust particles. Alternatively, you could just add that empty to your scene and have them actually, directing those planes toward you. If you do decide to do that method, you'll have to set the planes with the dust texture to no collision in the physics. So that's it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed the tutorial. I'll have this blend file available on the Wayward Art Company Facebook page for download. And that's it. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.